Hello everybody, welcome to Langar Zoogie. This is busy, everyone is up early for Saturday, this is awesome. I'm going to pass you all over to Ali and he can get going.
Amazing, thank you for the introduction, Emily. Thank you, Laura, for coming up with the idea. If you could make me the host, Emily, then I can share my screen. Right, everybody, if you're all sitting comfortably, then we shall begin. I'm going to start by introducing myself. My name's Ali Milne. I'm a full-time professional skydiver. I've been skydiving for more than 20 years now, and I've been working at Skydive Langar since 2005. I'm here today to talk to you about British skydiving tracking progression. The aim of this lesson is to increase your knowledge about British skydiving tracking progression. You might be an AFF student who wants a little bit more information about the different disciplines you can learn. You may be somebody that's already on the tracking progression system. You may be an experienced tracker that had nothing else to do on a Saturday morning who just wanted to tune in. Thank you all for joining. Now, that's who this lesson is for. If you're watching and you're a coach, I'm not saying this is the only way to explain things. I'm not saying this is the best way to explain things. I think this, as a coach, you should always be learning and always looking to improve. So in fact, if you asked me to do this exact lesson in 12 months' time, I'd probably give it a bit differently because that's showing that we're always improving and always getting better. Okay, so let's talk about your introduction to tracking. Tracking was introduced to you as fast horizontal movement that's caused by putting an angle in the body. And it's introduced to you either on AFF or category system. The position we teach you to start with is to have your head up, your hips out, and to point your toes. We then later develop that in formation skydiving coaching, where we change a few little things just to make it a little bit more efficient, getting away from people at the end of a skydive. Now, the aim of this tracking is always as an avoidance procedure, is to get away from people as far and as fast as possible. Okay, let's talk about tracking and angle flying. So the purpose of a tracking dive is to take a group of suitably qualified people who are going to fly at a similar speed and a similar angle in close proximity. So we can see straight away a tracking dive is already different to any other form of tracking that we've learned up until that point. Now, we often hear people talking about tracking or talking about angle flying, and if you asked 100 different coaches, they'd probably give you 100 different answers. So this is my take on it. Tracking is fast horizontal movement caused by putting an angle in the body. Angle flying is fast horizontal movement caused by putting an angle in the body. I think in skydiving we've got so many different subdivisions of categories, we don't want to keep subdividing it anymore. We can end up sounding like a fancy wine taster if we're not careful. It kind of sounded a little bit pretentious, going, yeah, I went for a track and then I went angle flying and then we went tracing and then we were zooming. So it's all tracking and it's all angle flying. So what we're going to talk about today, it's a lovely poster from the British Skydiving website. We're going to be talking about a brief introduction to the Tl1, Tl2 and Tl3 stickers. Now we can see there's a lot of different stickers there and a lot of different qualifications. One thing that I would say is by the time you've got 200 jumps, your license does not need to look like this. It doesn't actually make you any better at skydiving. It doesn't make you a cooler person having more stickers. One thing I would say is if you're going to be working on a couple of different disciplines, it's quite important to ensure you're doing a good amount of jumps per year, because if you end up doing 5 different things and you may be only doing 50 jumps a year, that's not really giving you the time to concentrate or be particularly proficient or even safe at all of them. So it's worthwhile just kind of picking a couple, although it's a good idea to give a few a try. Okay, so the minimum requirements for doing TR1 is you need a B license. So primarily the reason for that is spotting for a tracking dive is something that you will do before you leave the aircraft. And if you're leading a tracking dive, it's what you're going to be doing every single second you're in free fall. You're going to be assessing the distance you're covering across the ground. Also, the stage where you get to a B license is kind of the stage you're a little bit more experienced. There's a little bit less fear. If we teach people too much tracking too early, the effect that fear will have on their body is it affects your ability for spatial awareness and directional control. So by ensuring someone has a little bit less fear, they're going to be a bit better at maintaining a head. Even if you're not leading a track and dive, if you're on your belly, it's always a good idea just to keep checking that ground track, just to make sure you're not going too far away. Now, it said you need A to E of the FS coaching syllabus, and that's all the way up to the swoop to pin, which is pretty much right before the FS1. So you might as well get the FS1 before you do your Tl1. The reason is later, as you progress, as you get more experience on track and dives, you'll find that track and dives will just be one component as part of a jump. You may find it may be a track and dive, then everyone goes onto their belly, makes a belly formation, then everyone goes into sit fly, makes a sit fly formation, and then if you've got the people, everyone goes to head down, makes a head down formation. And being able to be qualified in those different disciplines and having that base proficiency, it's going to help you with your discipline, your experience, and also your skills. Okay, so Tl1 overview. It's belly tracking up to 45 degrees. It's not AFF tracking. We're going to teach you the new tracking position in a little bit. And it's qualifying you to jump on track and dive. So you need all the skills and abilities that's required for that. You need to be able to go faster and slower, steeper, shallower, and you also need to have flight planning knowledge and good break-off skills. We're going to talk a bit about some of those skills in the next few slides. Okay, so let's talk about the basic body position. So the basic body position, if we think back to the slide with the AFF student, had the head up, the hips out, the legs straight, and the toes pointed. You can actually see from this position, we don't have any of those things. We're going to talk about why. So first, the head is low. Now, when you're tracking with your head all the way up, that's really good initially for AFF progression because that helps maintain the arch, helps keep the stability. It's easy to pick a point on the horizon and start tracking towards it. But actually, when we have our head up, both our head and our chest end up acting as a big coefficient of drag, and that can slow us down. So by dropping the head, that reduces the surface area at the front half of the body, helps us go that little bit faster. We're going to have a bend at the hips initially. Now, remember the aim of the track and dive is not a group of people all trying to get away from each other as fast as possible. So we're not going to be going at the speed of the fastest person. A good sort of average speed that's sociable for everyone is probably the best plan. The little bend at the hips helps keep a little bit of brakes on, and that means we don't go super fast initially. And of course, if everyone's in the group, everyone's flying nice together, you can then add the speed. The arms are nice and relaxed out to the side. I tend not to do super lots with the arms. I think if you just kind of push them out to the side, have them nice and relaxed, then actually that helps with your stability. I find that we don't get a massive amount of extra speed from the arms. I think it's generally more efficient working on the legs for the speed, and only once they're maxed out, then the arms. Now, we then have our toes hooked. Now, on the flatter angle, it's probably going to be better for you pointing your toes. But as we're practicing to get a little bit steeper gradually, and then gradually work towards steeper than 45 degrees for the TR3, by having the toes hooked, that helps keep our lower legs a little bit stronger, and it helps keep the power on. Now, turning on the belly, you might think that turning on the belly is pretty simple, but one of the issues that we can get when we're teaching people to track, especially when they're tracking on their belly, is if we've got two people side by side, so if I'm tracking next to you, if I'm turning my head and I'm watching you, what actually is happening is I'm dropping their shoulder and I can end up flying away from you. So if we ever need to turn or we ever need to get closer to someone in that direction, we're just thinking about dropping our shoulder and then turning our head and looking over that shoulder just to get that little bit closer. Okay, now to go faster, we primarily are going to do that with the legs, straightening the body from the shoulders all the way down to the heels, and we can see here we've got the toes hooked out to the side. Now, if the toes were pointed in this example, what would actually end up happening is the legs would end up at this angle here, and the back of the legs would be acting as air brakes. The steeper we go and the more power you put on the angle, the more important that becomes. Now, arms are used for stability, but if you have maxed out your legs, then you can use the arms to go that little bit faster. And as I said already, hook toes for a steeper angle. Now slower, we're primarily going to be braking with our thighs. So if we go faster, we extend the legs. If we're going to go slower, then we push our knees in and we use our thighs here as air brakes. One thing that I would say is if you've ever had a bad exit from a track and dive and you're chasing the track and dive from behind, or even if you're in front of it, which is the correct place to approach from, if you're chasing it from behind and you're really putting the power on, it's a good idea anytime you're doing a big horizontal movement in any discipline in skydiving, is at some point during that approach, do a test stop just to see if you can take a little bit of the speed off and stop in time. If at that point you realize you're going too fast, it gives you plenty of excess room to finally put the brakes on and match the speed of the formation. Okay, so changing angle. So changing angle, there's lots of different ways of saying this. So let's have a look at some pictures. We've got a couple of people tracking here. We've got this example here and this example here. So let's talk about this example. So if this person wanted to go a little bit steeper, basically the mechanism of changing the angle is by changing the torso. And there's different terminologies and different words you can use to affect that. So if this person wanted to go steeper, they think about pushing their head into the forehead, into the ground a little bit more, and then lifting their butt and legs up that direction. And that would take them a little bit steeper. Whenever you're changing the angle, especially when you're in a group formation, you want to do that as slow and as smooth as possible. Let's have a look at the example here. Now, this is a very steep angle. This is probably like a TR3 kind of angle. If this person wanted to go a little bit shallower, they need to think about moving their head back and their hips forward like so. And that's going to change the angle of the torso. One thing you have to watch out for, an important safety point, and this is why it's a good idea to have a lot of experience before going on to a steeper angle, is if this person on the steeper angle here wasn't used to controlling the amount of air hitting them, it's very easy for them, rather than keeping the angle and smoothly leveling out, it's very easy for them just to cork very fast, and that could cause anyone behind them a super big problem. So that's why it's a good idea to build the skills up slowly, and especially when you go to steeper angles, maybe do some one-on-one just to practice that. Now, I came up with something that's a good way of explaining how to change the angle. I was on some segways before Christmas, had to go on them. And as I was on the segway, I thought, this is just like tracking. So if you've got some segways, maybe your drop zone should get some segways. No, that's a terrible idea. The injuries all over the place. But anyway, if the person on the segway wanted to go a little bit more forwards, they think about pushing their head forwards, their torso back, and their feet back, and that's going to move them like so. And if they wanted to go backwards, it's head back, hips forward, and pushing those feet forwards. So if you ever get a go on a Segway, that's a real good example of how to change angles when you're angle flying or tracking. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about belly tracking. I want to give James Moran the credit for making up these slides. When he was doing his training for TR coach, I always get the coach candidates to make up some training aids. And when I saw this, I went, that's mega, I'm going to copy that. And it's always good, if you see something good another coach does, copy that, and then that propagates some good technique. So let's use this slide for belly tracking confirmation. So we can see if this person wants to go steeper, they're pushing their head closer to the ground like so. If they want to go shallower, they're lifting their head and torso up a little bit. If they want to go slower, it's pushing the knees in like so, and faster, extending the legs and straightening the body. Okay, so that's the basics for TR1. Let's talk a little bit about some flight planning now. So with flight planning, I always think it's super important that you involve anyone that you're coaching in the flight planning so they can be part of the discussion and they can see sort of the rules and the techniques and good operating procedures for planning it. So let's have a look at this graph here. So down here, this is where the aircraft is running. It's running from this direction all the way up to here. It's an interwind running. You may use slightly different techniques if you're doing a crosswind running. And track and dive, what we used to do actually with track and dive is basically exit, pick a heading, track on a straight line, and track till you can't get back. But then as time to improve, you realise it's probably not a good thing to do. So what we're aiming to do is have some kind of flight pattern where we go out away from the line of flight, away from everybody else, and then make some kind of turn. Now the question would be, do you want to go first or do you want to go last? I generally prefer going out first on tracking dives. There are examples where I would go at a different place, and that would normally be if it's very windy. The reason that I do it if it's very windy is, let's say we got out last and it was windy. When we're flying across the wind, actually we're going to get pushed back like so. Whereas if we did that when we got out first, we could get pushed off the drop zone, end up downwind, and we don't want people landing off. Next question is, do you go left or do you go right? Now, that's a good question, and a good rule of thumb is, especially because most of the tracking stuff I do is at Langar, is whichever side has got more landing area. So if this side's got more landing area, this side's got less landing area, I'll pick the side with more landing area. However, one thing that you've got to consider as well is if you go out on this flight plan here and you track all the way like so, and actually the landing area is on the other side of the line of flight, another safety point you have to consider is before you fly your canopy underneath the line of flight, you've got to make sure all the other groups have opened, because you wouldn't want to start flying your canopy underneath all the others that are opening. So perhaps in that situation, actually, it'd have been better tracking the other direction. So the next thing is canopy pattern. We've covered that. And multiple groups. Now, different drop zones will have different standard operating procedures of how many tracking groups to put on a lift. The best way, so you might be a jump master, you might not really have much interest in tracking. The best way to separate, if you've got two groups, is have one go first and left, and the last one out last and right. That keeps them as far away as possible. But in theory, it is possible to take up to 4 tracking groups. And if you had 4 tracking groups, you'd need to split, as well as the line of flight, a dividing line. You need another dividing line along here, and you give each tracking group a quadrant. So this tracking group would be in this quadrant, next tracking group would be in this quadrant, next tracking group would be in this quadrant, and next tracking group would be over here. Now, one thing I would say is when you start having 2 tracking groups on the same line of flight, the experience required to lead a tracking group is much, much higher. And I generally think a person who leads a tracking group wants to be one of the most experienced people on the tracking dive, because there's a lot of responsibility. He's constantly thinking about the ground track. Do you need to change the speed? Do you need to change the angle? Have you got everyone in the group? Is everyone in their slot? Is everyone in their quadrant? What height is break off? There's a lot of things to think about, and that's a bit unfair to put all that responsibility on someone who's maybe not long qualified in tracking. So I always think you want to have someone with that little bit more experience and responsibility. Right, let's talk about break off. So break off on tracking dives is normally 5,500 to 6,000 feet. I always like to break off a little bit higher. It means we've got more opportunity to get back to the drop zone. So we break off higher. In addition to that, we open higher as well. I never open at the same height on a tracking dive because we're spending a lot of time, often with a large horizontal component, moving away from our safe landing areas. So we want an extra opportunity to get back into the line of flight. So break off higher and open high is a good safety point. When we get to the break off, we can see this is the tracking dive flight pattern. This is when we hit 5,500 or 6,000 feet. We can see this is a 5-way tracking dive. So a couple of people go off to the left, a couple of people go off to the right, and the person leading goes straight forward. Now, it's really important that nobody ever tracks back on a tracking dive, because you may have somebody who's missed their beat, missed their break off, and they're just trying to squeeze back into the dive at the last couple of seconds, and that increases the chance of there being a head-to-head. So by ensuring that everyone kind of tracks off forwards in this kind of formation, that ensures nobody's going to end up in that head-to-head situation. One thing I would say is if your tracking dive has actually kept you quite close to the line of flight, maybe due to the number of turns on the tracking dive, or maybe you haven't really gone that far, it's important that if you're on the extremities of the tracking group, so maybe you're this one here and you're close to the line of flight, or you're this one here and close to the line of flight, you don't track back onto the line of flight. And having that extra awareness of where you are, where the line of flight is going to assist in doing that. Now, once you've opened, you may be far away. That means you've done a good amount of tracking. If you're really far away and you're struggling to get back, you need to probably debrief your flight pattern. It probably means you've tracked out too far before putting a turn in. So if you're too close, you could be close to the line of flight. If you're too far, it's difficult to get away. You're looking for that Goldilocks zone in the middle. Once you've opened and checked your canopy, check your airspace, make sure your traffic altitude and position is clear, you then need to extend the range of your canopy as you fly back to the drop zone. One thing I would say, as trackers, if you've tracked away from the line of flight, when you then fit back into the flight pattern, it's your responsibility to make sure you give way to anyone else, because everyone else is on the line of flight. They're doing all the normal stuff. As trackers, we're the ones that have done the unusual thing. And if we can't fit into the flight pattern, we just need to land a little bit further away. That's our responsibility to do that. Okay, so normally what I do is in a smaller lesson is I'll ask some questions, give you a couple of seconds to think about it, and then I'll nominate someone to ask the question. We've got quite a lot of people here, so we'll just flash through the questions and you can answer them in your head to see if you've been paying attention and see if you've got them right. So first question, up to what angle for TR1? So the answer to that is on the belly, up to 45 degrees. Okay, next question. What is the primary drive for power? So everyone have a think. Primary drive for power is by straightening the legs and straightening the body. Okay, what is the primary way to change the angle? So everyone thinking caps on? The angle is primarily changed by changing the angle of the torso. And what must you never do on a break-off? Okay, we never track back on a break-off. Well done, you got them all right. That was fantastic. Okay, so let's talk about TR2. So it's a little overview of TR1. Talk a little bit about TR2 now. So TR2 is backtracking up to 45 degrees. Now, if you already free fly, then learning TR2 is going to help with your break-off, because for a free fly, sit fly jump, you're going to go from sit onto back into a backtrack, and then track away the first few seconds on the back. So this is going to help. If you already can free fly, and this will help your break off. If you can't already free fly and you've got your TR2, it just means when you learn to do sit flying, your break off's going to be pretty good. So, and those two skills are interlinked. I always advise people, if they're going to learn head down, what they've got to do is they've got to learn to backtrack first. And the reason is, if you don't know how to backtrack, all your early head down attempts, you're actually going to be backtracking, but you won't be aware of it. You're going to think that you're head down when you're not actually head down. So that's something to bear in mind. So learning TR2 before learning FF2. Now, one thing you've got to watch out for, and TR2, is you have no ground visual. You're completely relying on and completely trusting on the person that's leading you that has the ground visual. So you want to pick someone that you can trust and pick someone that's got a good amount of experience, but also good amount of experience with jumping at that particular drop zone. Now, backtracking is not suitable for solos. That's a safety point. The reason it's not suitable for solos is you can't see how much distance you're covering across the ground. You can maybe watch the aircraft for a little bit for the line of flight, but after a while it's too difficult to see. So it's very important we never do backtracking on solo jumps. And you always trust and follow your leader. Right, so let's have a look at the basic body position for a backtrack. And it's a good idea that if you can backfly before you start learning to backtrack. So if you've got any skills on the tunnel in that respect, that can help out big time. So position, we're looking for the head back in a direct line from the spine. We're looking at a straight line from the shoulders all the way down to the knees. And from the knees to the feet is variable geometry depending on what speeds we need to do. So this is going pretty fast with a little bit of brakes on. Arms nice and relaxed out to the side. It's something we see quite a lot in backtracking is people maxing their arms out for speed, so then they lose all of their stability. but actually they haven't maxed out their legs yet. And it's a similar thing to the belly position. Having those heels together and then turned out to the side is going to make your legs a stronger unit. The reason is the knees are a hinge joint. And if you keep them in the same forward-facing orientation that they are every day when you're walking, when they bend and go backwards, which acts as an air brake. So if you rotate them out to the side slightly, that stops that from happening. And if we want to go faster, exactly what I just said there. Straighten in those legs, heels in, and toes out to the side. Only once you've maxed out the legs do you then add the arms. Okay, to go slower, this is a good example of putting the brakes on. So the concept are, there's a couple of different ways of braking. We've got the big brakes, which are the lower legs here, that's like your hand brakes. And then we've got the little brakes, which are the arms here. Now, in an ideal world, if we've got a really experienced tracking group, all the backtrackers, you may find that they exit the aircraft, their legs are locked out straight, they're locked out straight all the way till the brake off, and the only thing that they need to do is to alter the angle of the hands to go faster and slower. And that's really good. That's a great way to do it, because it's really fast, it's really fun, and you're only using the arms. But we do need to have the skills of using the legs for brakes. And the reason we need to have the skills is everyone will do a bad exit at some point or other, especially when we get to bigger groups and we have 7 people in the door or 10 people in the door. Everyone's vying for that same bit of airspace. And if you've had that bad exit, you've done a couple of rolls and you end up behind it, you may end up approaching the formation super, super fast. And as you're approaching the formation super, super fast, it's useful as you're coming in just to put a little bit of brakes on. But let's say you overcook it and you're coming towards the formation. It's a good idea to be a little bit off to the side. You can use these big brakes to help you out, slow yourself down even faster. Also on dives, where we're going from a track to vertical and then do a head down jump, it's really useful just take a little bit of speed off just as we get into the vertical. So that's why we need those skills there. Okay, and whenever we're doing that, I want you to keep the rest of the body straight, all the way from the knees to the shoulders. And you can actually practice this position, because it can be a static position. You can practice that in the tunnel. Okay, now when do we need both of them? We've already covered that example when we're behind on a track and dive and we're catching up super fast. Okay, so let's talk about change in angle again. So change in angle, similar thing, the opposite way around. So if this person here wanted to go a bit steeper, they move their head back and they move their hips and their legs forward. Now, sometimes people will say when they're learning to go steeper that they can't, or they're struggling to move their head back. And it's just kind of like it's just a muscle memory thing. It takes people a little bit time to get used to. You do hear some people saying sometimes it's due to a build-up of air pressure behind the shoulders. I'm not really sure if that's the case, but just giving that little bit of extra effort, moving the chin and moving the back of the neck into the collar will help take it steeper. First few times you do it, you're probably going to overdo it, and that's why we do coach jumps as part of the TR progression system. Similar thing here, if this person wanted to flatten out, they could just move their head up a little bit, their hips and legs back a bit. They need to be very careful as they're flattening off the angle. Okay, so another picture from James Moran. We've got backtracking confirmation here. Starting with the head, if you want to go steeper, leading with the head. If you want to go shallower, sorry, wrong way around. I'll correct myself. So if you want to go shallower, moving the head like so. If you want to go steeper, moving the head back. Little bit of brakes, moving the arms here. Big brakes, moving the lower legs there. Okay, so next thing we're going to talk about the differences between belly and backtracking. Now, one of the things that I've noticed is a lot of times when I'm doing track and dives or load organising, either at Langar or over in Europe, it's often people aren't sure of what I'm about to say, and it often means they haven't had super lots of coaching. So one thing I'm going to say is tracking on the belly is easier than tracking on the back. Now, when I say that, a lot of people will be surprised by that. Some people that can only track on the belly at the moment will say, yeah, but I can't track on the back. I went, well, that's cool. I understand the difference between that concept. So let's say you had someone who was a brain surgeon, but they didn't know how to ride a bike. So if you said to them, what was easier, brain surgery would be easier for them because they haven't learned to ride a bike. But if they learned to ride the bike, riding the bike would be pretty easy. And the reason it's easier, we'll talk about a few different reasons. So we've got a picture on the right, and we can see there's a tracking group here. We can see this person is a little bit further away. Now, originally in this lesson goes on for like over an hour. I have to take a few slides out. We talk about slot flying and group flying skills, but we'll just talk a little bit about it now. We can see this person here is trying to almost lift their chin up to get the visual on the tracking group. If we end up behind the tracking group at any point and having to lift the head, it exposes the head and the top part of the chest, and that's an air brake, and that means it's more difficult to then get back into the group. So having the head dropped and the butt back is the best way, which means as a belly flyer, you want to be in this area over here. Let's have a look at the back flyers. So all the back flyers, even the ones that are a bit further away, they've got a fantastic visual of everything that's going on. Even if they're a little bit in front, they'd be moving their head and watching everything that's going on, and the movement of their head would then slow their body, and they'd end up better in slots. The visual is easier on a backtrack than a belly track. If you get stuck behind, it's easier to catch up because you can see everything that's going on. Turns are actually easier on the back. Now, we talked about when we're looking at someone on the belly, when I turn like so on the belly, this shoulder drops and I go away from you. Now, this time when the air is hitting me on the back, if I do exactly the same thing, if I turn my head, the same thing happens with the shoulder, but now the air is hitting me on the other side of the body, it's going to start pushing me closer towards you. So for backtracking, also back carving in the tunnel, whichever way you look with your head, it's going to also move your torso, and it's going to help you out with your movement, which that isn't the case when we're tracking on the belly. And steeper, I find, is a little bit easier. I find when people start going steeper on the belly, especially because your muscle memory is going to be maybe to arch into it and take it steeper, which isn't really the way that we want to do it. It's with the forehead, torso, pushing ourselves into the angle a bit steeper. Whereas on the back, we don't have any kind of muscle memory in that aspect. So it's just a case of getting used to moving the chin back and those hips forward. So it's easier to keep the visual on your back. It's easier if you're stuck behind on your back. The turns are easier on the back, and it's easier to go steeper on the back. So one recommendation I would say to you all is once you've done a small handful of tracking jumps, and like your Tl1 maybe takes 3 to 5 jumps, maybe you get to 10 belly jumps, and then your next 200 or 100, spend all of that in 10 minutes to go. Thank you, Emily. Spend all of that time learning the back fly progression, and then go back to the belly later on. Okay, so let's see if we have, or I have some questions for you. So, everyone have a think, why no backtracking solos? The reason is you can't see the ground. Who is in charge of the navigation? That's the person on the belly, it's a person that you trust, someone who's experienced, and they can see the ground. What is the most effective braking method on the back? That's by using both the arms and the legs. That's the most effective. You won't need to use that in every situation, but it's a way of coming to, or reducing the speed as much as possible. Okay, so we talked a little bit about Tl1 and Tr2. We're just going to talk a brief bit about Tr3 and give a bit of an overview of that. So Tr3 is steeper than 45 degrees on both the belly and the back. And it's normally expected that when we go steeper on the belly and the back, that you can do that on the same jump. So for that, you're going to need to be able to go flatter, steeper, 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 vertical, steeper, 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 steeper. So transition through the vertical is something that we're looking for someone to do both ways, because it's a slightly different skill or practice shifting from belly to back. And if you only do it one way, you won't be more practiced at the other way. So both the back and the belly. Sometimes people will say, once they've done a lot of backtracking and they're really steep and they're flying close to the vertical, they'll say, right, I'm good for my TR3, but actually they haven't done much on the belly steep angles. So once you've done your intro belly, on your whole tracking progression, you then do a big chunk of backtracking progression, then you go back and revisit the belly stuff and then work on the steeper angles at that point. So if you've learned well, if you have good techniques, if you've been well coached, then the inputs are going to be exactly the same. It's just they're going to be at a slightly faster speed, slightly faster angle. And as we're going faster and more air is hitting across the body, you're going to have to do things more precise. At a flatter angle, if you maybe waggle your arms or get an input wrong or kind of move your torso, it's not going to affect you as much as when you go perhaps over 200 miles an hour at 80 degrees. Anything that you do at that point is going to be very difficult to control if you start doing the wrong stuff. So that's why it's a good idea to gradually introduce yourself to the steepness. Now, FF2, which is your head down flying, is highly recommended. Now, FF2 and TR3, what comes first? It's an interesting question. A lot of people who do a lot of coaching will say, one comes before the other, but certainly it's like a chicken and the egg scenario. One way to think about it is if you're going for your TR3, then it's about the same time that you're doing your head down stuff. So that is to say, if you want to learn TR3, but you haven't done any head down progression, that's the time to start it then. Consequently, if you can fly head down or learning to fly head down, but you haven't done lots of steep angle flying, then that's when you want to learn that. And the reason is, when we're learning to fly head down, when we're perfectly 90 degrees, that's fantastic. You're going to be flying straight down like so. If, however, you're 5 degrees off, or even 2 or 3 degrees off, you're not going to be going vertical, you're going to be screaming across the sky, and the TR3 teaches you the control for doing that. Most of the journey when you're learning to fly head down, in fact, I'd say 80% of the journey is learning to fly consistently at 90 degrees. Once you can fly and hold the angle, the maneuvers, the level of difficulty of learning them is a lot less, but that initial chunk of learning to fly the vertical is where the challenge lies. So in learning TR3, if you start falling off at an angle like so or like so, you've got the control to bring yourself back close to or near to the vertical. One thing I would say is if you're learning head down or you're doing TR3 stuff with a coach, you're always going to be doing that away from the line of flight because you can cover very large horizontal distances. Okay, so that's a TR3 overview. And that brings us towards the end of the lesson. We have a little bit of time, so maybe some people want to ask some questions. But hopefully this lesson has increased your knowledge about the TR system. Hopefully I've shared some good practice and good techniques. And of course, trying to compress as much information into one lesson as possible. There's many things that I couldn't talk about in this short lesson. I would say that this lesson does not replace a TR brief. You still need to go and speak to your coach. You need to go and practice a few other techniques, including the exits and all the various things that you're going to do, especially on a backtracking break-off. But hopefully you've learned some things from tuning into this lesson.